John, hello, how are you?
I'm very good, Andy. It's very nice to see you. Thank you for the invitation to contribute.
Thank you for accepting the invitation to contribute. We're asking our contributors to introduce themselves by name and then to give us a kind of an overview of the kind of work that they do. Would you mind if we started by you doing that, please?
Very good. So I'm John Wyver. I'm both a media producer working for my own company, Illuminations, and for the Royal Shakespeare Company. And I'm Professor of the Arts on Screen at the University of Westminster. So I really enjoy sort of being on the boundary between being a practicing producer in the industry, dealing with very real problems of making mostly recordings of stage performances, but also documentaries. Dealing with budgets and rights and recalcitrant contributors, and then at the same time. Thinking about those processes, thinking about what others have created and what I create in that context, researching that, particularly researching the history of it, and trying to analyze that and think about the meanings that are created and the processes that that we all go through, and how that fits into a broad media and cultural ecology.
Great, thank you. As a former and very modest recalcitrant contributor myself, I'm grateful that you're still speaking to the likes of us. Can we start with that relationship then between the two sides of your work, in that you are someone working to create an art form that you are also the student and the scholar of? Can you tell us a bit about how those two worlds inform each other, or if they do or don't?
Well, I very definitely think they do, of course. I suppose I've long been interested in how you bring those two worlds together. I started as a journalist writing about television for Time Out magazine a really long time ago. And when I was doing that, I was really interested in trying to bring into the discourse of journalism about television the kind of developing media studies work that was being explored by academics, by people at the BFI and so forth. And I guess really for 40 years, I've been interested in trying to develop and contribute to that dialogue. It seemed to me then, and it seems to me now to a degree, there's quite a big gap between the practical world of production and the world of people thinking and talking and analyzing that world. Some of those researchers are very interested in the processes of production, and some simply are not, and don't see it as particularly relevant or valuable to dig into those production processes. I think there used to be perhaps almost a degree of hostility from both sides. I mean, I think that producers used to see academics as kind of an other, who were rather sort of dangerous in a certain kind of way, or at least threatening in a certain kind of way. And I think academics, in some senses, I mean, these are ridiculous generalizations, but I think academics have also, some at least, have seen an interest in or an engagement in the world of production as sort of tainting or kind of carrying with it certain dangers which would inflect and infect the sort of purity of academic analysis. And I think both of those positions are completely wrong. I think that the more you know, in general, the more you know about production processes and the way things work, if you like, in the real world, the better and richer your analysis can be. although of course you still have to maintain critical distance, and you have to understand the biases that come with that immersion in the quotes real world. But equally, I think if you're a producer, I think there is so much to learn from academic analysis and research work of all kinds, you know, traditional text-based analysis, but also the sort of practice as research work that people are doing in so many fields, including what you're doing. And I think that the two worlds can learn an enormous amount from each other. And in a way, I'd like, and I think in some small ways we are, I'd like to think that, you know, those two worlds don't continue to see themselves as distinct worlds, that actually we should all be makers and thinkers, if you like, and we should all have engagements in both of those different strands and sets of ideas.
Yeah, that sounds really great. Before I respond more substantively, do you mind just explaining for listeners the term practice as research?
Well, you could probably do that better than I, Andy. I guess it's not a question I was ready to answer, honestly. I guess there are a whole range of ways of working in an academic context where people are doing things that are not traditional forms of reading or archive-based study, or even you know, field work in the way that sociologists and anthropologists have done, but are actually making things, collaborating with a whole range of different kinds of people and disciplines, as a form of creating knowledge, you know, making films or making pots or you know, making digital art or reconstructing Roman trebuchets, or, you know, lots and lots of different kinds of hands-on work, which is still done with a rigor and an awareness of the methodologies that one is working with, and that is done also with an understanding that one is going to record that, document that, reflect on it, and share it with others, share the process and the knowledge that hopefully you come to create in that way. That's a really kind of rubbish, certainly not a definition, but it's a bunch of words anyway.
To lob something at you, I'm sorry. No, I think that's perfect. And you talked at the start about the desire to contribute to dialogue between these two worlds, which think of themselves as separate. And I guess practice research is a kind of embodied way of doing that, perhaps thinking about the physical and creative act. But as you say, in kind of methodologically rigorous, and in other words, in scholarly contexts, and sharing one another's contexts and methods and expertise. And you do that so ably. And yes, that hostility you talked about, that strange antagonism between different worlds, it is still there in some ways. But that makes it all the more important to be having cheerful, positive, optimistic, sharing and caring conversations, which will sound like anathema to some of our colleagues, which break down those strange barriers.
Of course, I think that's the case. I think that's it's really important to have both one's practices and one's ideas challenged and enriched in those dialogues. And I don't quite understand why people would not want to be open, either as producers or as traditional academics, to those kinds of dialogues. It seems to me, you know, that's exactly where really interesting new ideas can emerge.
Yeah, thank you. If it's all right then to turn to various aspects of your work, if we could talk a little bit, you mentioned the RSC, and I know that they're mega famous, but I guess just for anyone who's new to this world, we should clarify that's the Royal Shakespeare Company.
Yeah, so the Royal Shakespeare Company, classical theatre company that's based in Stratford-upon-Avon, does a whole range of productions and education work and so forth with the plays of Shakespeare, with other early modern theatre, but also with contemporary writing and with a much, I think, a much broader range of practice than perhaps some people have a sense of. You know, that it's a, I'm bound to say this, but it's a more it's a broader based and more open company than the words royal and Shakespeare might suggest.
Right, thank you. That's a great definition. So, I mean, it's been really fascinating in the last however many years it's been, and you're better placed to tell us how many it has been, to watch theatres embracing the digital world and non-live forms of mediation, some of them themselves live, in other words, live screenings in a cinema.
Yeah.
And we now seem to have reached a moment in cultural history where liveness feels like a privilege we no longer have, right? Certainly live accumulation of strangers in a room.
Yeah.
Would you mind telling us about both the challenges and the opportunities that that sort of mediation, that sort of world presents?
Yeah, I can do that in 2 sentences, Andy.
Great.
Not. So, well, the RSC has been doing ambitious and expensive live cinema broadcasts of its productions since 2013. And we have done 27 of the first folio plays by Shakespeare. And our hope, sincere hope, is that we may, by the end of 21, depending on everything that's going on now, do live broadcasts and therefore recordings of all of the first folio plays. The work that we do follows on from the work that the Metropolitan Opera started in the mid-2000s, and then NT Live, doing multi-camera live broadcasts of productions to cinemas. But that work, and this is part of why, you know, I'm interested in it as a researcher, that work continues traditions of such mediated presentations of stage productions that goes back to a long history of television presentations, both live and recorded, that stretches back to, you know, in Britain to 1930, and a 22-minute presentation of a one-act Pirandello play, which is sort of the first television broadcast that we can identify in a British context. And I'm always delighted that not only is it a stage play that is such the first television broadcast, but it's also a pretty obscure avant-garde piece of Italian drama that was presented in that way. And then before that, as we know, into a kind of whole rich history of screen presentations in silent cinema, of stage productions, and prior to that in lantern slides and in photographs and engravings and so forth. So I very much see what we're doing, you know, with really high tech 4K UHD digital recordings and 5.1 spatial audio in a tradition that goes back hundreds of years. And part of the fascination for me is trying to understand the links and the learnings that we can get from our practice now from that history and from all of the rich work that people have done on that history. I mean, this is a particular bugbear of mine, but the process of making these live broadcasts is expensive, it's complex, and it's highly skilled. I don't point the cameras, I don't do the live mixing, I don't balance the audio. I just try and bring a team together who are much, much, much better at all of those processes than I could ever be. Those people who do those processes have incredible craft skills and are making very real creative contributions to that process. And what ends up on a screen and then on a DVD or into your mobile phone is something grounded in, related to, still carries very, very strong elements and essences of the stage presentation and performance, but has also been transformed and translated into a new form that uh, is is both creative and shapes the meanings and the possibilities and the potential of that media object and of the original stage play in very complex and sophisticated ways. And it frustrates me that sometimes that people think this is just a matter of pointing a camera at the stage and then you've got, you know, a cinema broadcast or a live stream, or B, that you can engage with the screen version simply by talking about the original stage play. It seems to me absolutely fundamental that one needs as a journalist or a critic or just somebody kind of chatting about it. One needs to think about how what's on the screen and what's in your ears has been shaped by the processes that it's gone through to get to that media form. And there isn't yet, I think, although there's a lot now, as you know very well, there's a lot of really stimulating academic engagement with some of those questions. There's very little general journalistic engagement with those questions. And maybe in the, you know, the current lockdown, as seemingly people are valuing these engagements with theatre, performance, dance, opera, and so forth more, because they can't get into the, you know, the real world auditoria, maybe that broader awareness and that broader discussion of those processes, of the problems and potentials of that form, can start to develop. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of this moment.
Those were amazing two sentences. I love both of them. And incredibly rich for making us think about the creative contribution of a crew, and I guess also therefore the interpretive contribution of the crew that you're pointing us towards. Again, for people unfamiliar with some of the terminology, I guess I'd like to clarify that the first folio is the 1623 play collection, which is put together after Shakespeare's death of some of his work, most of his work, let us say. And I guess I'm also interested in the fact that that is itself another kind of interpretive mediation, firstly of what was happening on stage during Shakespeare's lifetime and a little bit after it. But it's also a form of mediation of the work that the RSC then do and that your company then does with the RSC's work. So there's kind of multiple kinds of mediation of theatre via book, via theatre, via screen, if that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. And the relationships between that, those different mediations is a fascinating set of questions. Just as is the fact that you know, the Royal Shakespeare Company has done 27 live broadcasts of Shakespeare's plays, and in that period, just one, as yet unseen, as live recording of another play not by Shakespeare from the early modern period. You know, the bias, if you want to call it by that word, or the centrality of Shakespeare to this form is as pronounced as is the centrality of Shakespeare to literary studies or to more general kind of popular culture in its awareness of English drama and literature. And I know that is something that you are deeply engaged with.
Yeah, I certainly want to do a shout out to that. There's wonderful productions of Faustus and The Roaring Girl I'm regretting starting my list now because I've really enjoyed almost all of them. So I'm going to miss lots of brilliant introductions out. But yes, in the time that these wonderful screenings of Shakespeare have been taking place, in a culture which has quite good availability of Shakespeare on screen, there have been these essentially unique productions of 16th and 17th century plays which do not get shared and mediated in this way. Perhaps we should just have that as a clarion call for doing that and just leave it.
Yeah, absolutely. And
the
reasons for that are complex. They're certainly not to do with the company not wishing that that might be possible. But you know, there are particularly very strong economic drivers to this work, which mitigate against being able to do a much broader repertory. I hope that changes, and I hope that we're able to find ways of creating compelling and enriching screen versions of a much broader repertory. And that's certainly one of the things that, you know, as a producer and as somebody wrestling with how you find budgets and how you apply processes in this kind of context, that's absolutely the key question. You know, I want there to be. I'm desperately disappointed that, you know, say Maria Aberg's productions of Webster over the last decade are not available in a screen version. And although there's very, very basic documentation of those productions in the RSC archives, actually the if only those productions could circulate more vividly in an educational context and in a broader audience context, then I think that would be a really, really good thing.
Agreed. Absolutely. Is it okay to move on finally then to some of your research-based work? And I'm aware that you're thinking in particular about the kind of the far end of television history, if that's the right way of putting it, the parts of television history most removed from our own moment.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've long been interested in how the arts in general, theatre, but also the visual arts and other art forms have been represented on television and taken, mediated for broad audiences. I am particularly interested in that and related questions about early television in Britain now. You know, I mentioned the Pirandello play that was presented in a very basic way in 1930. When the BBC started its broadcasts from Alexandra Palace in November 1936, it presented a really wide range of drama. Up to 1939 when the service closed down, and then from 46 onwards, as part of a really extensive schedule of work. We know almost nothing about the productions that were shown in that interwar period and in the period prior to 1953, when sort of people think television began, you know, because that's the year that the coronation was, and sort of there's a sort of myth that the coronation somehow was born along, or the coronation gave birth to television in a way. The coronation is one of the very first things that is recorded. One of the very first live television broadcasts that is recorded. It came along months after the BBC introduced a process for capturing live broadcasts. And so before the spring of 1953, we have no recordings of a really wide, extensive output of television, of dramas, of entertainment programs, of music, of operas, of current affairs discussions, and so much more. And I'm interested, and as a consequence of that, there has been very little study done on that period, certainly in program terms. There's lots of great engineering history, if that's what you're interested in, about early television, but there is very little cultural history of early television. And I suppose that is a particular focus now for me for my research. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Thank you. I mean, as someone who works in the 16th century and around Shakespeare, I'm very aware of how theatre is thought to coincide with the Elizabethan period, and you're now telling us that television, live television, coincides in exactly the same way with our own Elizabethan period, and that's kind of fascinating. And that's a binding together of technological abilities and production decisions about what you do with those abilities, and the historiographical moment in all kinds of strange ways, and the way that the nation is speaking to itself or of itself.
Absolutely. And the idea of the kind of creation of a particular idea of nation at that point in 1953, and the contribution that television makes at that moment and then through subsequent years is a really interesting question. But you know, there is a really rich Georgian television history to be written, as it were, which more almost coincides with the time on the throne of King George, who comes to the throne in 1937 and dies in 1952, with the coronation the following year. And that period of Georgian television feels like a kind of incredibly rich, unexplored terrain, as it were, at the moment. And I'm interested in what was shown, how it was received, who the audiences were, and I'm also really interested in, and I guess this is another kind of parallel with theatre studies in early modern terms, but also, of course, theatre studies more generally, in that we don't have any of the actual stuff. We don't have recordings of those broadcasts. So it is all of that is, in a sense, lost. What we have are traces of that in different ways, whether that's Radio Times listings or production memos or camera plans or a few reviews, or the odd mention in a mass observation diary or whatever. And so there is I think a really parallel kind of archaeological process of understanding television, its production and its reception from those traces. And I think that's I just think that's a really fascinating challenge for us, and one that I think also has very real lessons, if you like, or very real resonances with a media environment which is changing as rapidly as it is now.
Thank you. Something we're hearing again and again in these videos is that just because the archive is silent doesn't mean the history didn't occur. And thinking through how you recover and engage with and think about those histories that are otherwise lost, that's a really wonderful championing. So I think we've both agreed now that your next book's going to be called Georgian TV, and I'm looking forward to that.
I tried to get people to use the phrase Georgian TV. I've used it in all sorts of conferences and places. Nobody ever picks it up. I think it's a great phrase, but I can't find anybody who is prepared to use it as well. So. Well, I'm touched that I've now got one acolyte for it in the field of early modern literature. That'll really help.
You've championed academics and creatives coming together, and I wonder about something that might help with one of the issues you raised, the centrality of Shakespeare, which in lots of ways is the glorious thing, but also crowds out other people, and whether there's something about the kinds of conversations that you have professionally that maybe kind of unpacking of the marketing clouds of particular writers in favor of a broadening of not just marketing, but creative opportunity across a wider range of writers and different kinds of
Yeah.
writings. I feel like you've really showcased that wonderfully for us today. So thank you. John, I forgot to warn you about this, but we're ending videos by asking people if the word literature is a useful word to them and what it might mean to them. So I can stall a little bit and keep asking this question around and round and round to give you time to think about it. There is obviously no correct answer. We're just interested to see what responses people give. Is it a term that you would use in your professional capacity? Does it mean things to you personally or professionally? Sorry.
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? I mean, clearly it names something that we all have to deal with. You know, there is a commonly understood sense, however fuzzy that might be around the edges, of what literature is, and we kind of work with that, you know. I did an O-level, as it was in those days, in English literature. So, you know, my kind of sense of it is probably still strongly shaped by that. Does it shape what I make or read or go to? I don't see it, although maybe thinking of it negatively like this is in itself a constraint. I don't see it as a constraint. I don't see it as a sort of, you know, boundary that I'm either inside or outside. It's a notion that exists in the world that one negotiates in a million different ways. That's a really rubbish answer, isn't it?
It's not at all. I mean, it's a strange, complicated question, and it's a word which seems self-evident and yet very difficult to pin down, as
Right.
tend to be. But in many ways, you've already given us a really lovely example of how literariness can hover around our work, sometimes without us being aware of it, in the guise of the way that the 1623 play collection and the decisions that were taken around what plays go into that collection determine what RSC productions are now visible to us under lockdown. And that's fascinating because it feels like a 21st decision, and it is, but there are 17th century decisions mediated within it. And I think that's kind of intriguing and fascinating. John, this has been really fun. Thank you. I think I might have cut out.
You're very welcome.
Oh, no. Oh, good. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. I think it's great. It's a great project. I've really enjoyed watching some of the others, and I shall continue to do so. You know, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of it. Stay well.
Yeah, you stay well too. No, we're really honoured to have you. So thank you very much.